The sound of her fist against the door echoed through the empty hallway like gunshots. Amara's knuckles were already raw from pounding on 3 other doors in this upscale building, each one remaining stubbornly silent behind expensive wood and brass. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she glanced over her shoulder toward the elevator, knowing Marcus would figure out which building soon enough. The security in her old neighborhood was a joke, but this place looked like a fortress. Maybe someone here would help. Maybe someone here had the power to make him stop. The door opened with such sudden force that she stumbled backward, her bruised shoulder hitting the opposite wall. The man who answered was not what she expected. Where she had hoped for a kindly neighbor or concerned citizen, she found herself staring up at someone who radiated the kind of controlled danger that made her survival instincts scream. He was tall and lean, with the build of a man who stayed in lethal shape not for vanity but for necessity. His black hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour, and his dark eyes assessed her with the cold precision of someone accustomed to evaluating threats. He wore expensive pajama pants and nothing else, revealing a torso marked with scars that told stories she probably didn't want to know. "I need help," she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "Please, he's coming." The man's gaze traveled over her systematically, taking in the torn sleeve of her nursing scrubs, the purple fingerprints around her wrist, the way she favored her left side. His expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his posture. A subtle readiness that transformed him from merely dangerous to absolutely lethal. "Who is coming?" he asked. His voice carrying the faint trace of an accent that suggested English was not his first language. The question was delivered with the flat calm of someone who had faced down much worse than a desperate woman at his door. Before she could answer, the stairwell door burst open and Marcus appeared with 2 of his friends, their faces flushed with alcohol and fury. They spotted her immediately, and Marcus's expression twisted into the possessive rage she knew too well. "You think you can run from me, Amara?" he called out, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "You think hiding in some fancy building is going to save you?" The man beside her straightened imperceptibly, and Amara felt the temperature in the hallway drop several degrees. She had never seen anyone project menace with such effortless control, as if violence was simply another tool in his arsenal, readily available but perfectly contained until needed. He stepped slightly forward, placing himself between her and Marcus in a movement so smooth it seemed choreographed. "There seems to be some confusion," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made strong men reconsider their life choices. "This woman belongs to me. I suggest you leave before I decide to make this a permanent lesson in boundaries." Marcus, who had been advancing with confident swagger, stumbled to a halt as if he had walked into an invisible wall. Whatever he saw in the stranger's face drained the color from his cheeks and sent his companions shuffling nervously behind him. The silence stretched taut as a wire, filled with the promise of violence that hung around the man like expensive cologne. "You don't know what you're getting into," Marcus tried to bluster, but his voice had lost its conviction. "She's my girl. We just had a little argument." The man's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as cutting. "I do not repeat myself," he said softly. "Leave, now." The words carried such implicit threat that Marcus actually took a step backward, his bravado crumbling like wet paper. "This isn't over," Marcus muttered, but he was already moving toward the stairwell, his friends hurrying to follow. The man watched them go with predatory patience, waiting until their footsteps faded completely before turning back to her. Amara found herself pressed against the wall, trembling not just from fear of Marcus but from the sudden realization of what she had stumbled into. This man was not a good Samaritan. He was something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. When he looked at her now, she saw calculation behind the concern, assessment behind the apparent kindness. "You are bleeding," he observed, nodding toward her split lip. "Come inside. We need to discuss the arrangement I just made on your behalf." The word arrangement sent ice through her veins. "What kind of arrangement?" she asked, though she was already afraid of the answer. "The kind that keeps you alive," he replied simply, stepping aside to gesture her into his apartment. The interior beyond the doorway looked like something from an architectural magazine, All clean lines and expensive materials, but she could see the subtle signs of security everywhere. Reinforced frames, hidden cameras, locks that belonged on bank vaults. "I don't even know your name," she whispered. "Jin-ho," he said, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded remarkably like a cage closing. "And you just became the most protected woman in the city. Whether that is a blessing or a curse remains to be seen." As the deadbolt engaged with final authority, Amara realized she had indeed traded one dangerous man for another. The difference was, this one had just saved her life. The question was what price he would exact for that salvation, and whether she was strong enough to pay it without losing herself completely. Outside, the city sprawled in glittering anonymity, but here in this beautiful prison, her real story was just beginning. For those of you watching from your own safe spaces tonight, I wonder if you've ever had a moment where safety came from the most unexpected source. Where are you watching from as this story unfolds? Drop a comment and let me know what state or city you're in, because sometimes the most dangerous protection is exactly what we need to survive. Jin-ho moved through his apartment with the fluid efficiency of someone who controlled every aspect of his environment. Amara watched from the entrance, still pressed against the door as if she might need to run, as he retrieved a first aid kit from a cabinet that probably cost more than her car. Everything in the space spoke of wealth so profound it had become weaponized. The furniture was sleek and modern, positioned for both aesthetic appeal and tactical advantage. Windows offered a commanding view of the city while remaining bulletproof, their thickness barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing toward a leather chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. When she hesitated, his dark eyes fixed on her with the kind of patience that somehow felt more threatening than anger. "I am not going to hurt you, but we need to establish the terms of your protection before this situation becomes more complicated than it already is." She moved to the chair on unsteady legs, hyper-aware of how out of place she looked in her torn scrubs against his expensive surroundings. He approached with the first aid kit, his movements deliberate and controlled, and she caught the scent of sandalwood and something darker, more complex. Up close, she could see the fine details of his scars, the way his hands moved with surgical precision as he dampened a cloth with antiseptic. "The rules are simple," he said as he began cleaning the cut on her lip with surprising gentleness. "You stay here. You do not leave without permission and escort. You follow all security protocols without question. You do not contact anyone from your previous life without clearance. And you do not ask questions about my business or the people who come and go from this building." Each rule fell like a weight on her chest. "What you're describing sounds like prison," she said, wincing as the antiseptic stung. "Prison would be less comfortable," he replied without humor. "This is protection. The kind that keeps you breathing while we resolve your problem permanently." "How permanently?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Jin-ho paused in his ministrations, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her stomach flutter despite everything. "Permanently enough that you will never have to fear that man again. But protection of this caliber comes with a price. Total compliance. Total trust. You belong to me now until the threat is neutralized." The word belong sent chills down her spine, but she couldn't deny the relief that flooded through her at the promise of safety. She had tried everything else. The police, restraining orders, moving apartments, changing jobs. Marcus had connections she didn't understand and resources that seemed to multiply every time she thought she had escaped him. But this man, this dangerous stranger who cleaned her wounds with hands that had clearly dealt death, he radiated the kind of power that could actually stop someone like Marcus. "Come," he said, setting aside the first aid supplies. "I will show you your accommodations." The tour of the penthouse revealed layers of luxury that bordered on obscene. The guest suite he assigned her was larger than her entire previous apartment, complete with a marble bathroom that looked like something from a spa resort. The walk-in closet was already stocked with clothes in her exact size, designer pieces that still had tags attached. The bed was massive and draped in silk that probably cost more than she made in a month. "How did you know my size?" she asked, running her fingers over a cashmere sweater that felt like a cloud. I make it my business to know everything that might be relevant, he said from the doorway, his casual tone somehow making the statement more ominous than reassuring. The clothes will be replaced with better options once we have time to assess your preferences properly. The casual mention of preferences implied a timeline she wasn't ready to contemplate. This is temporary, right? She said, turning to face him. Just until Marcus gets bored and moves on to someone else. Jinho's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something that might have been amusement crossing his features. Men like Marcus do not simply lose interest, he said. They escalate until someone with more power forces them to stop. Permanently. The weight of that statement settled over her as he showed her the kitchen, the living areas, the home office that was clearly off-limits based on the way he barely paused at the door. Everything was beautiful and sterile, like a museum exhibit on how the wealthy lived. But underneath the luxury, she could feel the isolation. This was not a home. It was a beautiful bunker, designed to keep the world out and its occupant in. That night, after Jinho had disappeared into what she assumed was his own bedroom, Amara stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the city lights. The silk pajamas he had provided fit perfectly, another reminder of how thoroughly he had prepared for her arrival, even though he couldn't have known she would appear at his door. The bed behind her was more comfortable than anything she had ever slept in. The room temperature controlled to perfection, every amenity provided for except the one thing she wanted most. The freedom to leave. Her phone rang just as she was beginning to drift off, Marcus's name flashing on the screen like a curse. She almost declined the call, but the need to know what he was planning overrode her caution. You think you're so smart, hiding behind some Korean thug. His voice was slurred with alcohol and fury. But I've got friends too, Amara. Friends who know how to handle people who think they're untouchable. You're gonna come back to me, baby. One way or another. The call ended before she could respond, leaving her staring at the phone in her trembling hands. Marcus wasn't giving up. If anything, her escape had only made him more determined, more dangerous. The tears that fell weren't just from fear but from the crushing realization that her nightmare wasn't over. It had just changed venues. Jinho appeared in her doorway so silently that she gasped, her hand flying to her throat. The phone, he said simply, extending his palm with the same casual authority he used for everything else. When she hesitated, his voice sharpened slightly. Now. She placed the device in his hand, watching as he scrolled through the call log with efficient thoroughness. His jaw tightened as he listened to Marcus's voicemail, the controlled stillness that had intimidated Marcus returning in full force. This conversation is being traced, he said, his accent more pronounced when he was angry. My people will have his location within the hour. The friends he mentioned are being identified as we speak. By morning, Marcus will be in custody on outstanding warrants. I am confident they will discover in their very thorough investigation of his background. How can you possibly know that? She whispered. Jinho moved to her window, his silhouette dark against the city lights. Because I do not make promises I cannot keep, he said simply. And I promised you would be safe. But what happens to me when this is all over? She asked, the question that had been haunting her since she agreed to his protection. Do I just go back to my old life like none of this happened? He turned to face her, and in the dim light from the city below, she could see something vulnerable in his expression, a loneliness that his power and control couldn't quite hide. That will depend, he said quietly, on whether you discover that your old life is what you actually want to return to. After he left, closing her door with characteristic silence, Amara lay in the darkness trying to process the complexity of her situation. She was safer than she had been in months, protected by someone whose resources seemed limitless and whose determination to keep her safe felt absolute. But safety had come at the price of her autonomy, and she was beginning to understand that Jinho's protection was not just about keeping her alive. It was about keeping her, period. Outside her window, the city sprawled in glittering indifference, full of people living their normal lives while she existed in this strange bubble of luxury and danger. She was protected, provided for, and utterly trapped. The question was whether the cage, however beautiful, would become a sanctuary or a prison. and whether the man who held the key was her salvation or simply a more sophisticated form of captivity. As sleep finally claimed her in the silk-wrapped darkness, Amara's last conscious thought was that she had never felt so safe or so afraid at the same time. Tomorrow would bring new revelations about the extent of Jinho's power and the true cost of his protection. But tonight, for the first time in months, she could close her eyes without fear that Marcus would find a way through her defenses, even if those defenses came with their own complex and dangerous complications. Amara woke to the scent of coffee and something sweeter, more complex. The morning light filtered through blinds that had automatically adjusted to provide illumination without exposing her silhouette to potential outside observation. On the nightstand beside her bed, she found a steaming mug of coffee prepared exactly as she preferred it, with cream and a touch of brown sugar, alongside a plate of what looked like Korean pastries still warm from the oven. She had never told Jinho how she took her coffee. The realization settled over her with the same unsettling mix of care and control that seemed to define everything about her protector. He was either remarkably observant or had access to information about her that went beyond what any casual encounter should provide. Both possibilities were equally disturbing and, she had to admit, oddly touching. In the closet, she found clothes laid out for her. Designer jeans and a cashmere sweater in soft gray that complemented her skin tone perfectly. Everything fit as if it had been tailored specifically for her body, down to the designer sneakers that were exactly her size. The attention to detail was both impressive and invasive, making her feel simultaneously cherished and surveilled. When she emerged from her room, she found Jinho in the kitchen, fully dressed in a charcoal suit that transformed him from the dangerous man in pajama pants into something even more formidable. A businessman who commanded empires from behind mahogany desks while other people did the bleeding. He looked up from his tablet as she approached, his dark eyes assessing her with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "The clothes are acceptable," he observed, though something in his tone suggested it was more question than statement. "They're beautiful," she admitted, running her hand over the soft wool of the sweater. "But how did you know my sizes? My coffee preferences? You couldn't have guessed all of this." Jinho set down his tablet with deliberate precision. "I make it my business to understand the people under my protection," he said simply. "Your previous apartment was thoroughly documented before you arrived here. Your habits, preferences, medical history, educational background. Protection requires complete information." The casual mention of her medical history made her stiffen. "That's private information. You had no right to access my medical records." For the first time since she had met him, something shifted in Jinho's expression, a flicker of what might have been regret. "You are correct," he said after a moment. "However, if I am to protect you adequately, I must know if you have any medical conditions that could be exploited by your enemies or that might require special consideration during an emergency." Amara felt a spark of anger cut through her gratitude. "I'm a registered nurse," she said, her voice sharper than she had intended. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own medical needs. I'm not some helpless victim you need to monitor like a child." Jinho went very still, and she realized she had just challenged him in a way that probably few people dared. But instead of anger, something like interest flickered across his features. "A nurse," he repeated as if testing the word. "That was not in the basic profile my people compiled." "Because your people didn't look deep enough," she said, meeting his gaze despite the part of her brain screaming that antagonizing a dangerous man was poor survival strategy. "I worked my way through nursing school and was 3 months away from my degree when Marcus started getting violent. I had to drop out because he wouldn't let me attend classes. Said he didn't want other men looking at his woman while she was bending over patients." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Jinho processed this information. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she saw his hands curl into fists before he deliberately relaxed them. Their conversation was interrupted by rapid knocking on the front door, followed by Jinho's phone buzzing with what was obviously an emergency code. He moved toward the door with fluid efficiency, speaking in rapid Korean to whoever was calling. When he opened the door, 2 men practically carried a third inside, all of them speaking in urgent tones while blood dripped onto the pristine marble floor. The injured man had taken what looked like a knife wound to the shoulder, possibly during what Amara's trained eye recognized as an interrogation gone wrong. Jinho barked orders in Korean, clearly trying to coordinate medical response, but the injured man was growing paler by the second and the other two men looked like they were about to panic. Without conscious thought, Amara moved into the situation with the calm efficiency that had been drilled into her through countless clinical hours. "Move him to the kitchen island," she commanded, her voice cutting through their urgent Korean with the authority of someone accustomed to medical emergencies. "I need clean towels, a sharp knife for cutting clothing, and whatever first aid supplies you have. Now." Jinho translated rapidly, and suddenly she was the center of a coordinated effort to save his man's life. She worked with steady hands, assessing the wound, applying pressure to control bleeding, checking for signs of arterial damage. The knife had missed anything vital by millimeters, but the blood loss was significant and the risk of infection high without proper treatment. "He needs a hospital," she said as she worked, her hands never pausing in their efficient movements. "This needs surgical cleaning and professional sutures. I can stabilize him, but he needs more than first aid." Jinho watched her work with an intensity that made her acutely aware of every movement. "No hospitals," he said quietly. "Too many questions. Too many records. Can you handle this here?" It was a test, and they both knew it. She met his eyes over the injured man, seeing challenge and something deeper, something that looked almost like hope. "Give me proper supplies and I can do everything a hospital could do except general anesthesia," she said. "But I'll need to be in charge. Completely. No interference." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Jinho studied her face. Then he nodded once, sharply, and began speaking rapid Korean into his phone. Within 20 minutes, the apartment had been transformed into a makeshift operating theater, complete with surgical instruments, sterile supplies, and enough medical equipment to stock a small emergency room. Amara worked for the next 2 hours with the focused intensity that had made her top of her nursing class. Jinho stationed himself where he could watch her hands, observe her decision-making process, see the calm competence with which she handled a life-threatening emergency. She cleaned and sutured the wound with textbook precision, established an 4-line, administered antibiotics, and monitored vital signs with the expertise of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. When the injured man was finally stable and resting comfortably in the guest suite, Jinho approached her as she cleaned blood from her hands in the kitchen sink. "You saved his life," he said simply. "I did my job," she replied, though she couldn't keep the exhaustion from her voice. "It's what I was trained to do." "The way you commanded the situation," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "The authority in your voice when you gave orders. My men obeyed you without question because they recognized competence when they saw it. This is not the behavior of a helpless victim." Amara turned to face him, seeing something in his expression she hadn't noticed before. Respect. Genuine admiration for her skill rather than patronizing surprise that she possessed any. "I told you I wasn't helpless," she said softly. "Yes," he said, stepping closer until she could smell his sandalwood scent, until she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "You did tell me that. I apologize for not listening more carefully." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. To break the tension, Amara gestured toward the kitchen where evidence of their makeshift surgery was still being cleaned up by his efficient staff. "I suppose this means you trust me with sharp objects now," she said, attempting lightness. To her complete surprise, Jinho laughed. The sound was rich and genuine, transforming his face entirely and giving her a glimpse of the man he might have been in a different life, under different circumstances. "Perhaps," he said, still smiling, "though I reserve the right to supervise when those sharp objects are in proximity to my anatomy." That evening, after his injured man had been transferred to a secure private clinic for overnight observation, Jinho surprised her again by appearing in the kitchen with ingredients for what he claimed was a simple Korean meal. She watched him work with the same controlled precision he brought to everything else. His expensive suit replaced with dark jeans and a white shirt that made him look younger, more approachable. "You cook," she observed, accepting the glass of wine he offered. A man who cannot feed himself properly is vulnerable in ways that have nothing to do with enemies, he replied, dicing vegetables with professional efficiency. My grandmother insisted I learn before I was allowed to inherit any business responsibilities. The mention of his grandmother humanized him in a way that all his wealth and power could not. Amara found herself relaxing despite every instinct that warned her against trusting this dangerous man too completely. They worked side by side, he guiding her through the preparation of bulgogi and banchan, while she shared stories from her nursing school clinical rotations. For the first time since arriving at his apartment, she felt like she was talking to a person rather than a force of nature. Jin-ho asked intelligent questions about her work, showing genuine interest in the technical aspects of medical care, the emotional challenges of dealing with families in crisis, the satisfaction that came from helping people heal. When she described her plans to specialize in emergency medicine, his attention sharpened with something that looked like pride. You would excel in trauma care, he said as they sat down to eat. You have the steady hands and the calm mind necessary for that level of responsibility. The praise warmed her more than the wine, more than the perfectly prepared food. When had someone last seen her potential rather than her problems? When had someone looked at her skills rather than her vulnerabilities? Later that night, after they had cleaned up together with an easy domesticity that felt both natural and surreal, Jin-ho walked her to her bedroom door as he had the night before. But tonight, instead of simply bidding her good night, he paused with his hand on the door frame. The lock, he said quietly, gesturing toward the mechanism. It is not to keep you in. It is to ensure that nothing can get to you while you sleep. I want you to understand the difference. Why does that matter? She asked, though she thought she already knew. Because consent matters, he replied, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. Even in protection. Especially in protection. As he walked away toward his own room, Amara stood in her doorway watching his retreating figure and trying to process the complexity of emotions swirling through her chest. Jin-ho was dangerous, controlling, and had essentially kidnapped her for her own protection. But he was also unexpectedly thoughtful, genuinely impressed by her competence, and concerned about her emotional well-being in ways that went far beyond simple duty. For the first time since Marcus had started terrorizing her, she felt seen rather than simply protected. And that recognition was perhaps the most dangerous development of all, because it made her want to stay even when she was free to leave. The news came during breakfast on the third day, delivered by one of Jin-ho's security team with the kind of professional calm that made terrible information sound routine. Marcus had been released on bail after serving less than 48 hours, his lawyer having argued successfully that the outstanding warrants were minor infractions that didn't justify continued detention. More troubling, he had immediately begun what could only be described as an escalation campaign. Jin-ho listened to the report in Korean, his expression growing darker with each detail. When his man finished speaking, Jin-ho dismissed him with a sharp nod and turned to face Amara across the breakfast table. His movements were controlled, but she could see the tension coiled in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he was calculating how to handle a problem. What is it? She asked, though the sick feeling in her stomach suggested she already knew. Marcus has expanded his focus, Jin-ho said carefully, as if weighing each word for its potential impact. He spent yesterday afternoon parked outside your sister's workplace. He followed her home. He knows where she lives, where her children go to school. The coffee mug slipped from Amara's suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound like gunshots. Her sister Keisha had 2 young children, a 6-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son who called Amara Auntie Mara and drew her pictures of superheroes. The thought of Marcus involving them in his sick obsession made her feel physically ill. He wouldn't, she whispered, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were wishful thinking. Marcus had threatened her sister before, had made vague comments about pretty little nieces who looked just like their aunt. She had thought they were empty threats designed to control her behavior. Now she realized they had been promises. Jin-ho was already moving, speaking rapidly into his phone, while watching her face with the intensity of someone monitoring a volatile situation. She heard him giving orders in Korean, coordinating what sounded like a complex security operation. When he ended the call, He turned back to her with the kind of focused attention that made her feel like the most important thing in his universe. "Your sister and her children are being moved to a safe location as we speak," he said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone accustomed to making the impossible happen. "They will have round-the-clock protection until this situation is resolved permanently. Marcus will not get within a mile of your family. You can't just uproot their entire lives," Amara protested, rising from her chair with enough force to send it scraping across the floor. "Keisha has a job, the kids have school, they have routines and friends and a life that doesn't revolve around hiding from my problems." Jinho went very still, and she realized she had just challenged him again, this time on a matter that involved his operational decisions rather than just his personal assumptions. The silence stretched between them, loaded with the kind of tension that could explode into conflict or transform into something else entirely. "What would you prefer," he asked quietly, "that I allow Marcus to use your family as leverage against you? That I wait to see how far he is willing to escalate before taking action? Your sister's temporary inconvenience is a small price to pay for her children's safety." The reasonable tone made her even angrier because she couldn't argue with his logic. Everything he said made perfect sense from a tactical perspective. But logic didn't address the gut-wrenching guilt she felt at dragging her sister into this nightmare. The helpless rage at being unable to protect the people she loved without surrendering control of every aspect of her life. "I need to call her," she said, reaching for her phone before remembering that Jinho had confiscated it. "I need to explain why armed strangers are showing up at her door telling her to pack bags for her children." Jinho produced her phone from his pocket, but held it just out of reach. "You may call her, but the conversation will be monitored and recorded for security purposes. And you will not tell her where you are or give her any information that could compromise your location if she is questioned." The casual assumption that he would control and surveil her conversation with her own sister sent fury shooting through her veins like liquid fire. She stepped forward until they were close enough to touch, close enough that she had to crane her neck to maintain eye contact, close enough to see the surprise flicker across his features as she invaded his personal space. "You listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice low and tight with controlled anger. "That is my sister. Those are my niece and nephew. I will speak to them however I choose, for as long as I choose, without you monitoring every word like I'm some kind of security risk. I am not your prisoner, and they are not your pawns." For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, Jinho stared down at her with an expression she couldn't read. She had just spoken to him like no one probably had in years, challenged his authority in his own space over a matter that directly impacted his operational security. Every instinct told her she had pushed too far, that men like Jinho did not tolerate direct challenges to their control. Then something shifted in his dark eyes, something that looked almost like arousal mixed with admiration. "You are quite magnificent when you are angry," he said quietly, his voice dropping to a register that sent inappropriate shivers down her spine. "Very well. You may speak to your sister privately. But I will have men stationed outside the safe house, and any attempt to coordinate an independent extraction will be considered a hostile action." The phone appeared in her outstretched hand, and she realized she had won a battle she hadn't expected to survive. More unsettling was the way Jinho continued to watch her with that new intensity, as if her defiance had revealed something about her that intrigued rather than irritated him. The conversation with Keisha was heartbreaking and necessary. Her sister was scared but practical, more concerned about Amara's safety than her own inconvenience. The kids treated the sudden move like an adventure, especially when they learned their new temporary home had a swimming pool and a game room. By the time Amara hung up, she felt drained but grateful that her family was safe, even if the method of ensuring that safety came with strings attached. Jinho found her later that evening in the living room, staring out at the city lights while nursing a glass of wine. He moved with his characteristic silence, appearing beside her without warning, close enough that she could smell his sandalwood scent and feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Your sister sounds like a remarkable woman," he said quietly, "strong enough to protect her children while being protected herself." "She learned strength the hard way," Amara replied, taking a larger sip of wine than was probably wise. "Our father left when I was 12 and she was 16. She had to grow up fast to help our mother keep everything together. And you? Jinho asked, settling into the chair beside her with fluid grace. How did you learn your strength? The question hung between them like an invitation to vulnerability that she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. But something about the darkness outside, the wine in her system, and the unexpected safety she felt in his presence made her want to share pieces of herself she usually kept hidden. I learned that people leave, she said simply. My father left because responsibility was too hard. My first serious boyfriend left because I was too focused on school. Marcus stayed, but only because he wanted to own me rather than love me. I learned that I could only really count on myself, so I got good at being self-sufficient. Jinho was quiet for so long she thought he might not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a roughness that suggested he was sharing something that cost him. I learned that duty is heavier than love, he said. My family has been in the protection business for 3 generations. Not the kind of protection that comes with badges and legal authority. The kind that operates in the shadows, that solves problems other people cannot solve through conventional means. I inherited an empire built on the principle that strength is the only currency that matters. The admission hung between them like a bridge across dangerous waters. Amara felt something shift in her understanding of him, seeing not just the dangerous man who had saved her life, but the lonely boy who had inherited a burden he never asked for. Do you ever regret it, she asked. The life you inherited instead of the one you might have chosen. Every day, he said without hesitation. But regret is a luxury I cannot afford. Too many people depend on the strength I provide. Too many lives hang in the balance of the decisions I make. They sat in comfortable silence after that, both lost in their own thoughts, both aware of the electricity that seemed to arc between them whenever they shared honest conversation. The attraction that had been building since their first meeting was becoming harder to ignore, complicated by genuine respect and the kind of emotional intimacy that made physical desire infinitely more dangerous. When Jinho finally moved to leave, rising from his chair with predatory grace, Amara found herself standing as well. For a moment they faced each other in the dim light from the city below, close enough that she could see the conflict playing across his carefully controlled features. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. Amara, he said quietly, and something in the way he spoke her name made her breath catch. This situation is already more complicated than it should be. She knew what he meant, knew that the growing connection between them violated every rule of professional protection, knew that caring about her protector was probably the most dangerous thing she could do for her emotional well-being. But knowing something intellectually and being able to resist it emotionally were very different things. She rose on her toes, closing the distance between them by degrees, watching his eyes darken as he realized her intention. His hand slid from her cheek to cup the back of her neck, and she could feel his control wavering as surely as her own. They were a breath apart when his phone exploded into urgent buzzing, the sound shattering the moment like breaking glass. Jinho jerked backward as if he had been burned, answering the call with a sharp word in Korean. The conversation that followed was rapid and obviously urgent, his expression growing darker with each exchange. When he ended the call, his face had transformed back into the cold mask of professional competence that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Marcus was seen in the vicinity of the safe house 40 minutes ago, he said, already moving toward what she now knew was his armory. He has been monitoring our communications somehow. The security around your family has been compromised. The words hit her like physical blows. Somehow Marcus had tracked down her sister despite Jinho's resources, despite the supposedly foolproof security measures. Her family was in danger because of her, because she had brought this nightmare into their lives. But as she watched Jinho prepare for what was obviously going to be a very personal and very final confrontation, she realized something that should have terrified her but didn't. The cold fury in his eyes wasn't the professional anger of a businessman whose operations had been challenged. It was the primal rage of a man whose woman and her family had been threatened. Somewhere in the space between protection and attraction, Between safety and desire, Jinho had stopped thinking of her as a client and started thinking of her as his. And judging by the lethal precision with which he armed himself for war, Marcus was about to learn the difference between threatening a woman under protection and threatening a woman claimed by one of the most dangerous men in the city. The attack came during the 40 minutes Jinho was away handling what his security chief had insisted was an urgent business matter that required his physical presence. Later, Amara would realize the timing was too perfect to be coincidental, that Marcus had somehow compromised Jinho's organization deeply enough to know exactly when the building's primary defender would be absent. But in the moment when the lights went out and the emergency systems failed simultaneously, all she could think was that Jinho had promised she would be safe, and now she was trapped in darkness, while men with guns invaded their sanctuary. The building's security team moved with professional efficiency, herding her toward the reinforced panic room Jinho had shown her during her initial tour. But they never made it that far. The elevator opened on the 15th floor to reveal 3 armed men who had somehow bypassed every electronic defense the building possessed. The firefight that erupted in the hallway was brief and vicious, conducted with the kind of intimate violence that left bodies sprawled across expensive marble and blood-spattering walls that probably cost more than most people's annual income. 2 of Jinho's men went down in the first exchange, one taking a bullet to the leg that shattered bone, the other catching shrapnel from a grenade that turned the elegant hallway into a war zone. Amara found herself crouched behind an overturned marble table that provided questionable cover while automatic weapons fire chewed chunks from the walls around her head. Training kicked in before conscious thought. She had spent 2 years in emergency medicine rotations, had worked trauma cases in inner-city hospitals where gunshot wounds were routine Saturday night business. The injured man was bleeding out from a femoral artery nick, and the other was going into shock from blood loss and probable internal injuries. Without medical attention, both would be dead within minutes. "Cover me," she shouted over the gunfire to the remaining security team, then dove across open ground toward the injured men with the kind of reckless courage that came from knowing people were dying while she hesitated. Bullets whined overhead as she worked with steady hands, applying pressure to bleeding wounds, checking airways, doing everything possible to keep Jinho's people alive, while his enemies tried to kill everyone in the hallway. The fighting intensified when Marcus appeared with reinforcements, his voice carrying over the chaos as he shouted orders to concentrate fire on the security team while leaving her unharmed. He wanted her alive, wanted her conscious and aware when he dragged her out of this place to make his point about what happened to women who thought they could hide from him behind other men's protection. That was when Jinho arrived. She heard the stairwell door explode inward with enough force to embed steel in the opposite wall. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop as something far more dangerous than Marcus or his hired guns entered the equation. Jinho moved through the chaos like death in an expensive suit, his pistol appearing in his hand with fluid precision as he assessed the tactical situation in the space between heartbeats. The first man died before he realized Jinho had arrived, a controlled double tap to center mass that dropped him like a marionette with cut strings. The second managed to turn before Jinho's next shots removed him from consideration with surgical efficiency. Marcus's reinforcements tried to establish covering fire, but Jinho was already moving, using their shock at his sudden appearance to close distance with predatory speed. She had never seen anything like the way he fought. There was no emotion in it, no rage or fury, just the cold application of lethal force with the kind of efficiency that spoke of years of experience and training that went far beyond simple business protection. He moved like violence was a language he spoke fluently, each shot placed with precision, each movement calculated to maximize damage while minimizing his exposure. Marcus tried to use her as leverage, screaming threats about what he would do to her sister's children if Jinho didn't surrender immediately. Jinho's response was a bullet through Marcus's shoulder that sent him spinning into the wall, followed by a shot that shattered his knee and dropped him to the floor in screaming agony. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the gunfire had been. Jinho stood in the center of the destroyed hallway, surrounded by bodies and blood, his weapon still raised as he scanned for additional threats. When his eyes found hers, she saw something in them that made her understand exactly what kind of man she had been living with, what kind of power she had been trusting with her life. He was not a businessman who occasionally used violence. He was violence, refined and controlled and wrapped in expensive suits, but violence nonetheless. And he had just killed 4 men without hesitation or remorse to protect her. Amara, he said, his voice carrying the same controlled calm he used for everything else despite the carnage around him. Are you injured? She shook her head, unable to find words. Her hands still pressed against the wounds of his injured men as she tried to process what had just happened. Jin-ho holstered his weapon and moved toward her with the same fluid grace he always displayed, stepping over bodies like they were furniture that had been rearranged. Marcus was still alive, though his breathing was labored and his face gray with shock and blood loss. Jin-ho crouched beside him with the casual attention one might give to an insect that needed crushing, his dark eyes empty of anything resembling mercy. You threaten children, Jin-ho said quietly, his accent more pronounced when he was speaking with lethal intent. You brought guns into my home. You put her in danger after I told you what would happen if you continued this foolishness. Marcus tried to speak, blood frothing on his lips as he struggled for breath. Jin-ho listened with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world, then nodded once as if Marcus had confessed to crimes worthy of the death sentence he was about to receive. The final shot was clean and professional, ending Marcus's threat with the same efficient precision Jin-ho brought to everything else. When it was over, he rose and turned back to her as if execution was simply another business transaction that required his attention. Amara stared at him across the blood-soaked hallway, her hands still covered in other men's blood, her mind struggling to reconcile the gentle man who had cooked dinner with her with the efficient killer who had just eliminated 5 men without apparent emotion. She should have been terrified. Every instinct should have been screaming at her to run from someone capable of that level of controlled violence. Instead, all she could think was that he had kept his promise. Marcus would never threaten her family again. Never put her sister's children in danger. Never force her to choose between her safety and her freedom. Jin-ho had ended the nightmare permanently, and the cost in blood was simply the price of absolute protection. You saved my life, she said finally, her voice barely audible over the ringing in her ears from the gunfire. Jin-ho moved toward her slowly, giving her time to retreat if his proximity frightened her. When she didn't pull away, he knelt beside the injured men she was still treating, his hands joining hers as they worked to stabilize his people before emergency responders arrived. You saved theirs, he replied simply, nodding toward the men whose lives she had preserved through her quick thinking and medical training. That makes us even. But they both knew it was more complicated than simple debt and repayment. She had seen him at his most lethal and found herself drawn to rather than repelled by his absolute competence. He had watched her function under life-threatening pressure and discovered that his attraction went far deeper than physical desire or protective instinct. Later, after the bodies had been removed and the hallway cleaned by people who specialized in making violent incidents disappear, Amara found herself alone with Jin-ho in his private bathroom. He sat on the edge of the bathtub while she cleaned a graze on his shoulder that he had dismissed as insignificant until she noticed blood seeping through his shirt. You could have been killed, she said as she worked, her hands gentler than necessary as she cleaned the wound that was indeed minor but could have been so much worse. Men like Marcus are dangerous to civilians, Jin-ho replied, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing business. But they are not dangerous to me. I have been handling threats like him since I was 17 years old. The casual mention of violence starting so young should have disturbed her, but instead she found herself wondering what had happened to the boy Jin-ho must have been before duty and family legacy transformed him into the weapon she had witnessed tonight. Her fingers traced the edges of older scars on his shoulder and chest, evidence of a lifetime spent in the kind of conflicts that most people never imagined. I need you to understand something, Jin-ho said quietly, his hand covering hers as she finished bandaging his wound. Tonight was not an aberration. This is who I am. This is what my protection means. If that frightens you, if you cannot accept the reality of what loving someone like me requires, then I will arrange for you to disappear safely where no one will ever find you. The word loving hung between them like a confession neither had intended to make. Amara met his eyes and saw vulnerability there despite everything that had happened, uncertainty about whether she could love a man capable of such controlled brutality. "Does it frighten me?" she repeated slowly, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes. The violence frightens me. The ease with which you can take lives frightens me. But you know what frightens me more? The thought of leaving this sanctuary you've created. The thought of never seeing you laugh at something unexpected again. The thought of living without feeling this safe, this protected, this cherished." Something shifted in Jinho's expression, relief and wonder mixing with an emotion too complex to name. "You are not afraid of the monster," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I'm afraid of how much I need the man," she admitted, her hand moving to cup his face with fingers that trembled slightly. "I've never been protected the way you protect me. Never been valued the way you value me. Never been loved the way I think you're beginning to love me." The word love seemed to break something loose in Jinho's carefully maintained control. He pulled her closer until she was standing between his knees, his arms circling her waist as if he could anchor himself to her presence. "You have become essential to my existence," he said roughly, his face buried against her shoulder. "I did not plan for this. Did not want the vulnerability that comes with caring about someone more than duty, more than family honor, more than my own life. But you are in my blood now, Amara. You are the reason I breathe." They held each other in the aftermath of violence and confession, both understanding that they had crossed a line from protection arrangement to something infinitely more dangerous and precious. Outside, the city continued its oblivious existence while inside their sanctuary. Two people discovered that love could bloom even in blood-soaked soil, that safety could be found in the arms of someone capable of absolute destruction. The crisis was over. Marcus was dead. Her family was safe. But the real danger was just beginning, because now they both knew that what they felt for each other was worth killing for, worth dying for, worth rebuilding an entire life around. And that kind of love in their world was the most dangerous force of all. 3 weeks later, the last of Marcus's associates had been systematically eliminated or convinced to relocate to distant cities where their continued existence would not pose ongoing threats. Jinho's organization was thorough in ways that went beyond simple revenge, dismantling the entire network that had enabled Marcus's escalation until nothing remained but cautionary tales whispered in certain circles about what happened to people who threatened the wrong woman. Amara sat in Jinho's office watching him conclude the final phone call that would officially close the Marcus chapter of their lives. His voice carried the same controlled authority it always did, but she could see the subtle relaxation in his shoulders as he confirmed that the last loose end had been tied off permanently. When he ended the call and turned to face her, she saw something in his expression she had never seen before. "Peace. It is finished," he said simply, settling into the chair across from her with fluid grace. "Every threat has been neutralized. Every connection severed. Your family can return to their normal lives without security details or safe house protocols." The words should have filled her with relief, but instead they sent a chill of uncertainty through her chest. Her family's safety had been the justification for everything that had happened between them, the external force that had bound them together through circumstances beyond their control. With that removed, what basis did they have for continuing this strange, intense, dangerous relationship that had developed in the crucible of shared peril? Jinho seemed to read her thoughts with the same uncanny accuracy he brought to everything else. "The original terms of our arrangement are now void," he said carefully, his dark eyes watching her face for every micro-expression. "You are free to leave. Free to return to your nursing career, your normal life, your world where protection comes from police and laws rather than men with guns." He reached into his desk and withdrew a thick envelope that he placed on the table between them with deliberate precision. "Inside you will find documentation for a new identity if you choose to use it, enough money to complete your education and establish yourself anywhere in the country, and contact information for people who can help you disappear so completely that no one from this world will ever find you again." The offer hung between them like a bridge to freedom that she had never expected him to build. 3 weeks ago, she would have grabbed the envelope without hesitation, would have run as far and fast as possible from the beautiful, dangerous man who had turned her life upside down. But 3 weeks ago, she hadn't known what it felt like to be valued for her strength rather than protected from her weaknesses. 3 weeks ago, she hadn't understood that safety could come in forms that had nothing to do with physical security. "What happens if I stay?" she asked quietly. Jin-ho went very still, and she could see him weighing his words with the same care he used when negotiating business deals worth millions of dollars. "If you stay, it must be because you choose to, not because circumstances force you to. If you stay, it must be as my partner, not my protected asset. If you stay, you will have a voice in every decision that affects our lives together, including the parts of my business you choose to know about." He leaned forward, his intensity focused entirely on her, as if her answer would determine the trajectory of his entire existence. "I can offer you resources to finish your nursing degree at any institution you choose. I can provide funding for the trauma medicine specialization you described. I can give you a place in my organization where your medical expertise would save lives rather than simply treating injuries after the fact." The practical offers were seductive, but it was what he wasn't saying that caught her attention. He wasn't promising to change his fundamental nature, wasn't offering to abandon the dangerous world that had shaped him since childhood. He was offering partnership within that world, asking her to choose his darkness with full knowledge of what it contained. "And the personal aspects?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I stay as your partner rather than your protected asset, what does that mean for us?" Jin-ho's controlled facade cracked slightly, revealing the vulnerability beneath his carefully maintained authority. "It means I am asking you to love a man whose hands are stained with blood. It means trusting that the violence you witnessed is reserved for threats against what I protect, never for you. It means accepting that I will never be safe in the conventional sense, that enemies will always exist, that the price of loving me includes accepting a level of danger most people cannot imagine." He stood and moved to the window overlooking the city, his silhouette dark against the afternoon light. "It also means you would be the most important thing in my world. More important than business, more important than family honor, more important than the legacy I inherited. You would be choosing a life where you are cherished absolutely, protected completely, and loved with the kind of devotion that would burn down cities if necessary to keep you safe." The honesty in his admission took her breath away. This wasn't the proposal of a man offering conditional love dependent on her fitting into his existing life. This was the surrender of someone willing to reorganize his entire existence around her presence in it. She rose and moved to stand beside him at the window, looking out at the sprawling city where normal people lived normal lives, where protection came from locks and alarms rather than men who killed with surgical precision. For a moment, she tried to imagine returning to that world, tried to picture herself in a hospital emergency room treating gunshot wounds instead of preventing them, tried to envision a future where safety meant being alone rather than being claimed. The image felt hollow, incomplete, like a photograph with the most important person cropped out of the frame. "I want to negotiate terms," she said finally, her voice carrying the same steady authority she had used during medical emergencies. Jin-ho turned to face her with an expression that mixed surprise with admiration. "What terms?" "First," she said, stepping closer until they were breathing the same air, "I finish my nursing degree and specialize in trauma medicine exactly as I planned. Your resources can help, but this is my career, my accomplishment. Second, any children we have grow up knowing they have choices beyond inheriting your world. Third, you teach me enough about your business that I can be a true partner, not just a protected asset who happens to live in your bed." The mention of children sent something raw and hungry across Jin-ho's features, a longing he had probably never allowed himself to acknowledge. "And fourth," she continued, watching his reaction carefully, "you stop treating our relationship like a protection contract and start treating it like a partnership between equals who happen to love each other enough to make this insane situation work." Jin-ho was quiet for so long she thought he might refuse her terms. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the rough edge of emotion barely held in check. "You would give up safety for partnership," he said. "You would choose love with a dangerous man over security with anyone else." "Every time," she replied without hesitation. "I would choose you every time, Jin-ho. Not because I need protection, but because I need you. Because you see my strength instead of my vulnerabilities. Because you make me feel like the woman I was always supposed to be." The kiss that followed was inevitable, necessary. a claiming that went both ways as they finally acknowledged what had been building between them since that first night when he had stood between her and danger. His hands buried themselves in her hair, while hers traced the scars that mapped his dangerous history, both of them understanding that they were choosing each other with complete knowledge of what that choice entailed. 6 months later, Amara walked across the stage at the university graduation ceremony in a cap and gown that represented the completion of dreams deferred but never abandoned. In the audience, Jinho sat beside her sister and the children who had stopped calling him the scary man and started calling him Uncle Jean after he taught them to make Korean cookies and helped with homework using patience that surprised everyone. The nursing degree felt like proof that she could build a future rather than simply survive the present. The trauma medicine specialization that would begin in the fall represented her choice to use her skills in service of Jinho's world without losing herself in it. That evening, they celebrated in the penthouse that had transformed from elegant prison to genuine home. The same space where she had once felt trapped now felt like sanctuary, decorated with photographs from her graduation, artwork from her niece and nephew, evidence of a life built through choice rather than circumstance. Jinho found her later on the balcony, looking out at the city lights while wearing the simple platinum band he had placed on her finger during a private ceremony witnessed by his inner circle and her family. The ring was not a shackle but a symbol, representing partnership freely chosen rather than protection forcibly imposed. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling beside her with the easy intimacy of someone who belonged in her space as completely as she belonged in his. "Only that it took Marcus threatening my family to bring us together," she replied, leaning into his warmth. "I wish we could have found each other under better circumstances." Jinho's laugh was soft and genuine, the sound of a man who had discovered that happiness was possible even for someone like him. "If we had met under better circumstances," he said, "you would have run from me immediately. You needed to see me protect something you loved before you could trust me with your heart." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city sprawl beneath them, while above them stars struggled to shine through urban light pollution. Around them, the walls of their sanctuary enclosed not a prison but a haven, not a place of captivity but a home built on the foundation of two people who had found in each other something worth fighting for. For all of you who have followed Amara and Jinho's journey from desperate collision to chosen partnership, I hope their story reminds you that sometimes the most unexpected protection comes from the most dangerous places. Love doesn't always arrive safely or conventionally, but when it arrives absolutely, it can transform even the darkest situations into something beautiful. What did you think of their ending? Did their love story capture your heart the way it captured mine? Let me know in the comments below, and thank you for joining me in exploring what happens when safety and danger, protection and love, fear and trust collide in the most unexpected ways. In the distance, sirens wailed as the city conducted its endless business of crisis and resolution. But here in their elevated sanctuary, Amara and Jinho had found something rarer than safety, more precious than security. They had found each other, and in a world where both love and danger were forces to be reckoned with, that was perhaps the most powerful protection of all.